Welcome everybody to Idea Exchange. Idea Exchange is all about sharing ideas between peers, leaders in mission-driven organizations, so folks can learn from each other, not from theory, but from practice. Sponsored by 108 Ideaspace. This is your host, Ashish Malik, hosting this particular podcast. This is meant for executives working in associations, nonprofits, and regulatory bodies, navigating modernization, trust, scale without losing the sight of purpose. Today's guest operates at the center of one of Canada's most high-stakes systems. Dr. Viren Naik is the president and CEO of the Medical Council of Canada, responsible for assessing physician credentials and informing licensure decisions nationwide. I hope I got that right. He stepped into the role at a time of physician shortages, system strain, and growing pressure to move faster while without lowering standards. And today we are talking about leadership, trust, and transformation at national scale. So Viren, thank you for agreeing to doing this with us. Welcome to Idea Exchange.
It's my pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to talk with you, Ashish, and certainly to share my ideas with your vast audience.
That's amazing. So where I wanted to start today is Viren, working with you for the last number of months, years. I know you accepted the CEO role recently, if I can call it recent. It's pretty recent in that context. What problem did you mostly wanted to be responsible for solving, and why now?
Well, it seems longer than recent. I've been starting my third year here as CEO, but the reality is, in a post-COVID world, we've seen that healthcare that's always been sort of on a tipping point of challenge really got pushed over that tipping point. We've seen a challenge in the health human resource space and in my world particularly physician human resources. The reality is that after COVID we had a backlog of surgeries, we had an increased burden of disease, and we had really increasing strains on the system that came on the tail end of that pandemic. On the other side of it, though, we had the challenges and the realities that we saw a great amount of attrition from the workforce, from burnout, from people deciding to take retirement earlier, to people in the health workforce themselves getting sick. And so, as I say, healthcare was on a bit of a tipping point. We've kind of crossed that tipping point, and I think most patients in Canada probably can relate to the realities of the challenge in getting timely healthcare right now.
Mhm. Yeah, and were there any surprises during the first 90 days, 6 months?
First 90 days. Well, I think the biggest surprise is how rapidly evolving the environment is. The term VUCA environment is popular now among leaders of volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. The reality, I'd say, is that I've been involved in healthcare leadership for a while, and certainly involved in assessment and regulation for a while. And in general, much like our universities and academic institutions, hospitals, regulatory institutions, assessment organizations, they don't need to, they've never been challenged to move rapidly to evolving VUCA environments. And so the culture of the organizations are not necessarily the same as that of a startup, appreciating rapid, agile decisions. In a lot of ways, these organizations are really set up more for waterfall, being certain of the decisions you're making, not making mistakes, for all the reasons as those approaches make sense in healthcare in particular. But the reality that we needed to pivot to a more agile, rapid, and responsive organization.
hmm And I think you're so right. Things have not been volatile more than what they are today in
Mhm.
today's world. So now I know MCC's big objective, if you look at it as a regulatory body, is to serve regulation and licensure at a national scale, of course. How do you define MCC's strategic contribution today, beyond just the exam and credentials?
Well, we've always been a critical part of the system of regulation and certification in Canada. We are part of a national assessment to the national competencies that all medical school graduates in this country do at the end of their medical training when they obtain their degree. But the reality of the organization and the reality of Canada in general, and I'm quite proud to be son of immigrants, is that Canada has always depended on immigration in all sectors and to be a prosperous country as a whole. I know some of those ideas are sometimes challenged, but the reality is this country has always been dependent on immigration. Healthcare is no different. The reality is that about one quarter of our physicians are international graduates or internationally trained physicians. And so, given that people are coming from other jurisdictions in the world, MCC has always, this is not a new thing, we've always played an important part in that system in terms of making sure that the credential that the person's coming from the jurisdiction that they're coming on is valid. And that becomes even more important in days of increased fraud and increased AI ability to create fraudulent documents. So we play a big role in credential validation. But the reality that depending on the jurisdictions that where a person arrives from, there may be some assessments that need to be done as well. And so MCC has always served that international community. I would say almost in a ratio of 3 to 4 to 1 than it did the Canadian medical graduate system. And so while we've always served that important part of the system, one of the important things that I think that we're being more explicit about is our service to that international community. The reality, and then I'll stop talking here, is that in the crisis that we're not going to be able to solve that crisis immediately through domestic graduate production. We absolutely have to approach how we can become more self-sustaining as a country by increasing medical school positions, increasing the number of medical schools, and increasing the number of postgraduate training positions. But
Mhm.
in the short term, as those things take time and a lot of important government will, given that we are a publicly funded educational system, while all those things evolve, in the short term, we are going to be dependent on internationally trained physicians to uh, help essentially stopgap and importantly know that it's not just about a stopgap. We've always appreciated and depended on international grads, but know that that dependence is going to increase in the short term.
Mhm. And that kind of speaks to the reliance on immigration, and we know, like, given the current landscape, we're trying to put some brakes on immigration right now, or at least reduce that, so we can focus on other things. The question, I think, is how does that impact? On one hand, we need more people, more skilled people, and on the
Mhm.
other hand, we are dealing with some of these challenges. So how does that impact MCC
Yeah.
and your role and your strategic objectives?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we need to address as a country is coordination. We have many different silos that operate in isolation. To your point of, IRCC, our Immigration Canada pillar, that is obviously using whatever metrics it uses to make its decisions along with the government. The challenge, I think, is that right now we are well, one is we need to ensure that we have the infrastructure and supports for the immigration that is being proposed. But we also need to think about how that immigration could be targeted to areas that where we need obviously help, healthcare being one of them. I think that one of the things that we need to work on when I speak of coordination is that we do have a lot of immigration that comes for healthcare, with the assumption, and I don't blame people for this, that if I arrive in Canada and I have my certificates and my credentials, that I'll be able to work in healthcare right away. And as said earlier, there are some checks and balances, and including appreciating that there are unique Canadian competencies that need to be learned or assessed as part of that. Now, having said that, I'd say that as an organization, we were less, to use a business term, customer facing about it. I think we weren't, while we were serving the system through our assessments and validations, we weren't serving the candidate. And I think one of the big moves and changes that we've made, which sort of fuels all of our strategy and our operational decisions, is that we're here not just to serve the system. Absolutely, we're here to safeguard the safety and patient safety of Canadians, but we're also here to serve the candidate. And that means that we have to inform a person before they make the decision to immigrate to Canada that of the realities of what the requirements might be and how those requirements can be quite complex, given that we have regulation at a provincial level, we have different countries of origin, we have different specialties of all of these different physicians who are coming. It can be quite complex, not unmanageable, but we have to lean into that navigation, if you will. And so I think that's a big part of what we've tried to do as an organization and continuing to try to do. That speaks to people who are immigrate or thinking about immigrating here. The reality is we also have a large group of permanent residents who have already immigrated to Canada and who are being underutilized for their skills and their education that they brought to our country. We need to think about how we can get that unutilized potential healthcare workforce serving Canadians. And I think MCC has a role with its other partners. I mean, it's not us on our own to see how we can get folks back into clinical practice and maybe even to help into their full practice so that they can serve Canadians as we work through this deficit.
Mhm. I'm going to piggyback on a few things that you mentioned here. The candidate
Mm.
experience, I think that's important. At the same time, we often also hear, the whole process and the pathway for the internationally trained physicians is complex and could be hard to interpret as well. Um, and then you have a responsibility for protecting the Canadians, and that's, maintaining those standards. So how do you strike this balance between, the trust, protection, and the speed in which you do things as well at the same time? You talked about agile, for example.
Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost is to appreciate that we haven't, I think turning the mirror on ourselves and appreciate that we haven't been that agile. I think the reality is even when you think about when I speak about patient safety and I speak about standards, we have to ask ourselves, are those standards, when's the last time that those standards were established? And it's definitely not about eliminating standards. I think everyone would appreciate that, including the candidates themselves, but it's about modernizing those standards and really asking ourselves, what is it that the candidate needs to demonstrate so that we can be sure that Canadians will receive safe care? Um, in doing so, we need to ask ourselves in a complex system, like you've just said, and I've said, which checks and balances are necessary, which checks and balances are redundant, meaning that they are being done over and over again. And so, how do we really streamline? This journey to licensure, if you will. I often joke that if the journey to licensure was a track and field event, it looks like a 10-kilometer run with lots of hurdles in the way. I think we have to ask ourselves, is the 10 kilometers necessarily, or can we have a shorter race from start to finish? Again, a safe race. And what hurdles are absolutely necessary in that shorter race? Now, I think that the reality when I talk about standards that is and evolving standards and modernizing standards that gets even more complex is that healthcare itself is changing. We are seeing the importance of competencies of team-based practice, where it's not all about the individual physician, but really the ability to operate within a team of nurses, a team of other health professionals, so that you appreciate that it all doesn't land on the doctor's shoulder. At the same time, we're seeing, and I don't have to say this to a technology company, we're seeing the great leaps and strides that are being made by AI, which is quite frankly dominating every sector, and healthcare being no different. I'm seeing, and it's the reality that physicians appropriately are leaning into AI more and more. As they lean into AI, you start to ask yourself again, what are the competencies to know how to use AI appropriately? And what competencies become less critical when AI is part of that team-based care?
And are you looking at that as one of the possible solutions? How are you uh, adopting AI? In other words, like to, in your standards, and you talked about modernization.
Yeah, so I think, I think AI is, as you know, an elephant, and they say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. I think when you start thinking about AI, I can speak first about medicine and medical education. I think it's no different than any education industry, K to 12. You want to make sure that in the education system, people are learning how to use AI appropriately, using it as a tool, certainly not completely depending on the tool, at least at this time. I don't know where things will go. Similarly, in healthcare practice, I'll say that, I like to sometimes say, if I can pause for a second, Ashish, that ChatGPT is all of 3 years old. I like to remind people that, and when people say, "Oh, this and that," look how far we've come in 3 years, and the reality that whatever ChatGPT you're using today or whatever AI you're using today is the worst one you'll use because it just keeps getting better and better. And so, we started with people were, with regulation, healthcare, you can't use AI, you can't use AI. It's not. Then we moved to, well, you can use it to help you scribe, AI scribes with your patient so that you're capturing all the data. And then even that was sort of controversial. Now we're talking about it being integrated into electronic health records, so that it's there if you want to use it. Now we're talking about the EHR is going to potentially just decide that you're entering stuff and respond and remind you haven't asked about this or you haven't asked about that. And now we're even talking about if the EHR suggests something to you and you don't acknowledge it or you don't act on it, is at that point, is it negligence that you've not acted on the AI? So in 3 short years, we've progressed that far along delivery in healthcare. So when you talk about an organization that, assesses people on their delivery of care, well, at what point do you say, well, yeah, you don't need to necessarily know the 18 causes of acute pancreatitis off the top of your head. But what you do need to know is how you can access that information and how you can get the information to work through the diagnosis of this patient, whether it's with resources available on handheld devices or whether it's by working with AI through the system.
Yeah, and there's so many possible use cases with AI, and we can talk about them all day long.
Yeah, we could be here all day.
Yeah, one question that comes to my mind, especially understanding and knowing MCC for a little bit now, if we were to zoom out 3 years, what would have to change for you to say, the that MCC has evolved and not just improved?
Oh, geez, you're asking. And just for all the listeners, he didn't share these questions with me, so I certainly am thinking on the spot. I think that some of you're asking me here with or if I can morph the question, but you're sort of getting at KPIs or OKRs, like key results and performance indicators, and at the end of the day, I think again as a leader, you're reaching for that big goal. And the big goal is that we've at the patient level that we have more patients connected to doctors in Canada. And as I said, if we are the first gate to getting doctors into Canada through various ways, then the outcome should be that we have more patients connected to doctors in Canada, and we don't, whatever metric you want to use along that, wait times, rostering, whatever you want to see, that those are all things that we would want to see. I think the other reality is that I would want to know that to the point about the complexity in the system, that somehow in 3 years, through all of the different transformations that we're doing, we become truly a candidate advocate, a candidate voice, and a candidate go-to for understanding the complexity. I don't see the complexity changing tomorrow, but our ability to untangle the ball of yarn would be appreciated, and we would see that because candidates would see us not just as a necessary evil in terms of their credential validation and the assessments they might go to, but a go-to to help to understand the system and understand how to integrate themselves in the system. And lastly, I would say, I think that I would want, while the public might not know or have MCC roll off the tip of their tongue, I'd want the MCC to really be that trusted partner in the system from government to others. That if there's a challenge in the HHR thing, I'd want MCC on speed dial as one of the folks that we have a problem that we need solving in this space. I don't think we can build tires tomorrow, but if you're talking about in the healthcare space, obviously, I'd want us to be on the speed dial to some degree.
Mhm. And so thanks for that. I think that sounds very promising. You mentioned the whole issue of the complexity and the complexity is not going anywhere. Modernization and standards, like in the current situation, current landscape, do you like are you able to pinpoint and say where most time is lost during this process? Is it verification, exams? I know there are so many steps that you have to manage in
Yeah.
an organization.
Yeah, I think this gets back to the coordination piece a little bit. Like I think we've got a lot of things that are happening, some in our box and some outside our box that are happening sequentially
Mhm.
instead of in parallel. So, for example, if you're not in this country, can some of the immigration applications be done at the same time as you're having your credential validation and going through your assessments? In fact, one of our advocacy points and navigation points to candidates themselves is do a lot of that stuff before you or while you're in the immigration application process, so that what doesn't happen is that you immigrate to Canada, you're going through these processes, and one of the most critical things that a healthcare person will tell you themselves and that regulatory bodies will tell you is um, the most challenging thing to lose is recency of practice. The reality is that when you're not in front of patients and not practicing your craft, those skills and knowledges decay very quickly. And so it is a key metric that we look for in regulation. Well, if you're doing things sequentially, that recency of practice can elapse. Now, our goal is to mitigate any loss in recency of practice. So, how can we do a better job to do things in parallel? Where can we shorten gaps like credential validation and so forth? Now, some of that is on us, but some of it is the realities that some countries like ours are digital and even moving beyond digital, but some countries are analog still. And some of those source documents and collaborations and cooperations, they're analog. And so again, this is where you say when you've got an analog process, the more we can do in parallel, the better we can essentially get there. So there's a lot that is working. I don't think anything's broken. It's just not, and of course, everything a la Toyota can be done a little bit better. But I think the bigger win can come from better coordination. And I'll just also say, as a Canadian, I think this becomes particularly important because while I'm speaking about the crisis here in Canada, in healthcare in general, this is a global crisis. The World Health Organization is predicting a shortage of 10 to 16 million healthcare workers globally. So, the reality is that like countries to us, arguably US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, they're all in the same crisis or about to be in various stages. And so you don't just have a global crisis, you have a global competition. And um, if we don't bring clarity to the complexity, if you can just imagine, people will move in the path of least resistance. And if there are a lot of resistors and complexity in the Canadian process, we're going to be losing the opportunity. And right now, I do say opportunity because, as we know, we mentioned before VUCA environments. I don't think the world has ever been more VUCA, and I do think that Canada has a moment right now to welcome those who might want to immigrate to this country and serve this country with the skills and knowledges that they've trained for a significant portion of their life for.
Mhm. Yeah, because every problem equals opportunity.
Absolutely.
Uh, I'm gonna switch gears. While I was doing some research, I know MCC is also involved in some initiatives, NRP being one of them. You want to talk a little bit about that? Like, what is NRP, National Registry of Physicians? What is it trying to make possible that wasn't
Mhm.
possible before?
So, at the risk of saying that we do have a gap in the Canadian system. The reality is that, sometimes people, if you go way upstream, will ask, how did we get here? How did we get into this HHR crisis? The reality is that we don't really have a good single source of truth of how many physicians are in this country, where they're practicing, what they're doing, and different than other countries, and for all the reasons that we do it, healthcare is really regulated at the provincial level, right? That's part of the Canada Health Act, and that delegated healthcare to the provinces. So a lot of this data sometimes is living at the provincial level, and it's living with the provincial regulators. The National Registry of Physicians, the NRP, as you describe it, is truly a cooperation and collaboration with the regulators in all 10 provinces and 3 territories, such that it would become essentially a repository or a source of data. The data remains the ownership of those regulators, but a place where the data flows to so that we can answer a lot of these HRHR questions and not do all the important predictive modeling and other things that we can do. That's probably going to be the biggest long-term impact of the NRP. More immediately is the reality that because we are provincially regulated, most physicians have a license in a single province, the province where they usually work and live. And COVID is a good example of something that showed us, if Viren Naik could maybe come and help in province XYZ, he that would be wonderful because we have a shortage or we have a need. But that's easier, sounds easier than it actually is because becoming licensed in another province is complex. You have to go through all those same checks and balances that we talked about. The NRP has hoped that it will. There's certainly a lot of talk about should we move to a national license model so that you have a license to practice in Canada, not a license to practice in Ontario. But the reality is that's constitutional, and it requires a lot of movement, as I said, from the Canada Health Act, which I don't think is going to happen overnight. What the NRP will do is it'll facilitate what we call multi-jurisdictional recognition, so that now if Saskatchewan has a need and Viren Naik can help, then they will be able to look into this registry and see that Viren Naik is in good standing in Ontario. So let's feel comfortable to give him a license here as well, as opposed to making him jump through the checks and balances. And the last thing it'll do is, as it evolves, is and again, depending on your audience, might not surprise people to learn that all doctors, their what we call scope of their practice narrows as they get into practice. So Viren Naik is an anesthesiologist, but Viren Naik doesn't practice and doesn't deliver any pediatric or child anesthetics. If we can get that data into something like an NRP, it's going to help us even better resource plan. I like to use the example, Ashish, of an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor. The reality is, an eye doctor isn't an eye doctor isn't an eye doctor. They all have a specialty, either it's the front of the eye, the middle of the eye, or the back of the eye. Well, it doesn't help if a small city has only eye doctors that work in the back of the eye. What they need is a mix of doctors that work on all the different segments of the eye. And so the NRP could help with some of that HHR planning.
Mhm. Yeah. And that is what makes it not just an administrative effort, but this is more strategic.
Yes, exactly. I think the hard thing about databases and data is it's sometimes not sexy, but it's critical as we roll forward. I'd say not just in healthcare, in all sectors, so that we can be better informed and better poised in our decision making.
Mhm. And I think to make all of that work, the technology underneath is really going to be important as well. And say, how do we scale this? How do we make sure not just, it's safe, secure, and all those good things. And I understand you're yourself going through this digital transformation. So wanted to
Yeah.
focus a little bit on that and ask you this question. When you're modernizing a mission critical organization like yours, what criteria matters most in technology decisions? Is it like
Uh,
risk, time to value, security, sustainability? There's so much.
which one's the most important? I think they're all important, unfortunately. But I think what's important to an organization, and as we go through what I'll call a digital transformation, I think fundamentally we had to again turn the mirror on ourselves. I'm very proud of this organization. When you talk about regulation and assessment and all of our core businesses, this organization was leaps and bounds ahead of other organizations in similar space in terms of their data architecture, their approach to data, their digital systems. But and we're talking a decade or more going backwards. The reality is that the digital world has changed, and platforms and security and all the things that you've talked about has changed. And I'm saying all that because it really needed us to ask ourselves, and with great, incredible heavy lifting, but are we a software organization, or are we in the business of IT infrastructure and our IT architecture, or is our business the things that I've talked about before? And so if our business isn't IT architecture, and that includes developing a platform or developing an assessment exam, et cetera, that we're not going to necessarily take to market and just use internally to deliver on what our actual core strategies and mission and vision is, then it lent itself to ask ourselves, well, at that stage, should we continue to build, or instead should we be looking for a product or service that could serve our needs off the shelf? And I think that, it's hard, right? That's a hard thing to do because you, you don't you're not trying to say that your baby is ugly and that you're going to get a new baby.
Mhm.
But it is a fundamental change in an organization, and a change that takes some courage. And so we certainly didn't completely abandon the idea of building completely, but and just say we're out of this. What we said though is that if we're going to move forward, one is we have to look at all of our systems and say, is there a COTS product, a commercial off-the-shelf product that can serve the needs? And only when we've done that exhaustively do we say, okay, there's really nothing out there, and we need to have a customized solution. The reality is, almost in I don't want to say all, but I'd say in a large percentage, if not getting close to certainty, the world has changed so much that there are commercial off-the-shelf products that can serve almost all the needs of an organization who are in a different kind of business, whether it's CRMs or other enterprise platforms and so forth. And the reality is that a couple things come by going that way. There's some pros and cons. The pros are a lot of things you talked about. I mean, if you built something, security, cloud systems, all these other things, you're also building the back ends of all those things.
Mhm.
I just talked about coordination. The reality is that if you're building something, you got to think about all the APIs and all the other things that are going to mesh together with the other partners in your world. Whereas again, if you're on a commercial off-the-shelf system, those things usually evolve for all the reasons that they do. And again, it allows you a little bit more focus on your core business as opposed to these other things. The downsides is that, again, and I joke about it, is it is a massive change management strategy that you have to undertake because people get used to being able to customize every element that they want, as opposed to potentially considering changes in workflow,
Mhm.
and recognizing that if the workflow needs to change, that probably the workflow we're asking you to change to is because many organizations have been in this COTS product and have found that this workflow works, even though you've become cultured in a particular workflow. And so we talk about it being an IT transformation, but I really do think it's as much a people transformation.
Mhm.
And I think we're in the middle of it, and we're just now starting to see people really understanding the benefits of how this is really going to serve them internally. But more
Mhm.
importantly, and this is what you really have to focus on, whether you're a disciple of Lean Six Sigma or whatever other business philosophy you do to it's a little bit about us internally, but what it's really about is externally. And so all of this, how is it going to serve our system in our example, and our candidates in our example?
Mhm. Yeah. And in our consulting practice, we call it like PPP, which is people first, then the processes, and then the platforms.
Yes.
And
I love it. PPP. I'm going to steal that one.
feel free. And I guess that is why we call it a digital transformation and not just digitization, because
Mhm.
it was digitization. You take an existing process and you fix it and you say, how do we digitize this and move it online? Um,
Mhm.
right? Uh, Now, you touched upon an important thing, like, and I see that time and again with mission-driven organizations, they're not IT firms. They are attached to a purpose, a mission. So, what does, in your opinion, a good partnership look like in leading such a large transformation, both from a vendor perspective, from the organization perspective as well?
Well, I think you're asking me. I'll do my best to be as broad stroked as I can. I think everything starts from trust. I don't know. I don't think that's just between an organization and a vendor. I think it's between the executives around your team. I think it's between uh, the employees in your organization. I think it's with the consultants you're working with. It's with everyone. Honestly, Ashish, I live my entire life by trust. And I don't know if you or your listeners have ever heard of the trust equation before. That's where trust equals or is proportional to your credibility, your reliability, and your intimacy, or your ability to make a connection with the person. But what it's inversely proportional to is self-orientation, meaning that if I saw that the vendor was not in uh, in this partnership for the greater good of what we could do for patients and for our candidates, but it really just about lining pockets and this and didn't really even understand our vision and our mission. That would leave me challenged. I think that I always look that a vendor, and that gets right back to the process around the RFP, that they've done their due diligence to understand our business so that they understand, so that we can start. Trust just gets built upon serially, but that ground floor is really anchored in the greater good, particularly as a not-for-profit. And I'm not Apple that's looking that has shareholders. I'm really more about the realities of our our challenges in healthcare and how we're going to address those. And if the vendor, the partner, the other organization that's coming to help us understands that that's where we're anchored, everything else is off of after that is easy.
Mhm. And I totally concur that. I think it's about aligning with a bigger purpose. And when that alignment happens, everyone on the team is actually working with the same goal in mind. How easy or difficult it is to achieve that, or how do you find that?
Well, try. I wish trust was easy to do. I think listen. I think a measure to achieve it. I think I said this to somebody very recently. They said, "What did you learn in your MBA?" And I joke sometimes because people used to tell me that you're going to go do a 2-year MBA and you're going to learn it's all about communication. It is all about communication, right? It's about open, transparent communication. And again, that's all built off of trust, right? Because you're not going to be open and transparent if you have no trust. You're not going to share, your hopes, your challenges, your successes, your failures. All that has to be open and transparent. If people are, I always say that when everyone around the table is showing scorecards and projects that are all green, 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 and nobody's asking questions, then you've lost that communication entirely. Somebody taught me the term the watermelon scorecard, where it's green on the outside but red in the middle, right? You really want to, you want to have the safety, which comes with trust, to have those open conversations. And so, um, it takes time. I'm not going to tell you that it happens overnight. And sometimes, unfortunately, you find yourself with a partner where the trust that was lost and can never be regained, or that just never really evolved in that trust equation. And I think the reality is that sometimes the hardest thing for a leader is to realize you've made a mistake with a particular partner and cut your losses and move in separate ways. But the opportunity cost sometimes of staying with a partner that's not there needs to be weighed in that equation a little bit. And I think part of us is where, as because I presume most people listening to this will be Canadian, maybe some American, but I think it's a very Canadian thing of us um, to not give up on something, which is great. It's one of our Canadian values, but at the same time, I think I think at a certain point, if trust is lost, if trust can never be gained, then you have to decide how you're going to move forward.
Yeah, and I think in the end, it's a leadership decision and accountability as well. Uh,
Mhm.
I'm glad you didn't say, one of the the joke about the MBA is being a paid job search.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'll just say quickly about the MBA because I recently gave a lecture there. I certainly think people who are in the MBA, or if for those on the call or those thinking about it, when you're in it, um, it can be depressing. You can wonder, what am I doing here? I'm learning. Am I learning things I already knew that, or the stuff I'm learning isn't relevant? I will tell you that as I was going through, people would say, you talk different now, or you look at things a bit differently, or you dissect things a little differently. And so I joke that it was a little bit like the Karate Kid, if you've seen that movie, where
Mhm,
in the MBA or in any sort of, I'll even say any sort of formal education around leadership, I do think there's an immersive component to putting yourself out there as a leader and getting experience. And I always say Oscar Wilde said, experience is the name we give our mistakes. Well, yes, you have to make those mistakes to be a leader, but at the same time, any formal education, any formal looks that you can take, the reality is there is a little bit of Karate Kid going on. You're waxing it on and off, and you're learning things you might not realize it, and then when you get into the game, if you will, you realize, oh wow, I do have these skills to use.
mhm. Yeah, I think the word that comes to my mind is being able to articulate what's going on. Getting the instant, just get the
Yeah.
message across appropriately. Now, looking back,
Mhm.
what's the one lesson you would like to share with the CEOs listening to you on this podcast, just to understand, something they should do before approaching modernization of a platform?
Yeah, I think I think you I think this is a big decision for an organization, obviously, modernization of your systems. If I was a CEO, I think a couple things. I think one is you need to understand the readiness of your organization. And I always say, most CEOs, I mean, most organizations, if you're not for profit or if you're publicly traded or whatever, recognize you're not in this decision alone, right? I think there is sometimes a board above you and an executive team around you. And when you're in a volatile, uncertain thing, as much as it's lonely at the top, and believe me, I understand that cliche plenty. And I actually say it's. I always thought it was just a thing, but 3 years into being CEO, it is lonely at the top. But recognize you do have people around you, and I think you want to use the people around you, the board, the executive team, to really understand the readiness of your organization. I think um, I think part of the discussion around it will, unpack intended consequences. It will also unpack unintended consequences and also unpack hidden consequences or blind spots that you might have as a CEO, despite whatever logical direction or decision you've made in the space. I don't know any CEO that knows the nuts and bolts of every nuance of their technical operation, technological or digital operation. And I'm no different. I didn't know how X or Y will impact A, B, or C. But in sharing the idea of moving to this decision, some of those things came to light. So the awareness, it didn't change the decision, but you're going in a lot more eyes open, if you will. Um, I think the other things that I would say to a CEO is recognize that I don't want to say it's not sexy, especially to the podcast that I'm on. It's obviously very sexy work to the folks who might be listening to this. But the reality is, if you're if it's the backbone of your organization, but not your vision and your mission critical, it's not a strategic objective in your organization. The reality is, it's an enabler to your work, to you achieving the goals that I just talked about earlier in the podcast. And so I can talk about all the wonderful transformation we're doing in here. Patients don't care. The systems don't care, but it's critical. And so it's not going to be something that you can go out there and talk about and say how amazing work you're doing. It is a bit like house cleaning. Nobody comes over and says how clean your house is. They say how beautiful your house is, but it's got nothing to do with how clean your house is. It's the appropriate housekeeping you need to do. So it is an investment that's not necessarily going to be a sexy externally thing, and it's going to hurt because a lot of investments and time and resources is going to go towards it without you necessarily being able to celebrate externally to the customer all the wonderful things that you did internally, if you will. But that doesn't stop that you should do in internal celebrations and milestone celebrations. And the last thing is recognize that your organization in going through this, I mean, this is usually a heavy lift. That's on top of whatever your key strategic objectives are. And so if you need external help for that, whether it's consultants and others who can help manage the project, and quite frankly, also mitigate some of the, I'd say, the heuristics and natural biases that you might have within your organization about the success of the project, consider using those consultants and those external parties strategically because it may help the project continue to move forward.
Mhm. That's all great advice, and I like the one, don't expect a medal at the end. Yeah.
No.
Viren, this was amazing. I don't know where the time went. This was
I don't either. I talk too much. That's how the time goes so fast. Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending the time with me, and I'm sure there's so much to take away for our audience from this this discussion.